you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. I need to apologise to Florence because I had hoped to write some thoughts down, but didn't get to that stage. But this has been a useful prompt to get me to think about some things that I need to prepare for a paper. So I'll see if I can share my screen. There we go. So the title of my talk is Muppet or Environmental Superpower. And this was inspired by, maybe inspired isn't quite the right word, inspired by Boris Johnson's talk to the UN General Assembly in September, where he was urging member states to bring forward more ambitious climate targets ahead of COP26. And he suggested that we should reject the claim of Kermit the Frog, who, for those of you who are not familiar with the Muppets, there was a show in the 1970s and 80s, and there have been a series of films subsequently, a sort of a children's show with these puppets created by Jim Henson, and the sort of the compare of the Muppet show is Kermit the Frog, and he used to sing a song about how it wasn't easy being green. And Boris Johnson took the opportunity to exhort the UN General Assembly and say, actually, it is easy to be green, and we should be ignoring Kermit the Frog. For those of you who are not so familiar with more slang-based versions of the English language, the term Muppet also means not just a nice puppet that Jim Henson can put on the television, it also means an incompetent or foolish person. So when Boris Johnson conjoined himself with a Muppet, it did lead to quite a lot of commentary in the UK about, you know, what did this say about our leader that he was talking about Muppets of the UN General Assembly? And that sort of prompted my title, is the UK able to claim to be an environmental leader or a superpower post-Brexit, which is one of its stated ambitions, or are we in fact a bit of a Muppet? Underpinning that slightly sarcastic title are a set of more serious questions, which are, the UK has stated it wants to be an environmental superpower. So what does that actually mean in practice? What does that look like? How does that sit within the UK's global Britain strategy? So it's repositioning of itself on the world stage post-Brexit. And as you said, Richard, given that we've just had COP26, it's a sort of a good moment to have a look and see how we performed at COP26, which was a good first test for the UK as we were chairing the meeting as well as participating. I should warn though that this is very much a work in progress. COP26 literally just finished a couple of weeks ago, and I certainly haven't had the time to fully digest what happened. I'm looking forward to future work coming out from those who are actually there, but nevertheless, it's a good moment to sort of try to start taking stock and thinking about these issues in a little bit more detail. I have, as Richard said, spent a lot of time in the last few years working on the impact of Brexit on UK environmental policy. So what I'll do initially is just talk a little bit about the history of UK environmental policy in the EU, the UK's reputation as a climate leader, the potential impacts of Brexit on environmental policy, before turning to the sort of the idea of global Britain and COP26, and maybe trying to address this question about whether or not the UK is an environmental superpower or a Muppet, or, you know, is it putting its money where its mouth is? Is it sufficiently ambitious, and can it implement the plans that it's outlining? So if we turn to the relationship between the UK and the European Union in the field of environmental policy, there is a consensus in the UK environmental policy literature that our environmental policy was profoundly Europeanised. And there's a fantastic book written by Andy Jordan, who I work with a lot, who's based at UEA, looking at the Europeanisation of British environmental policy, where he traces the history of UK environmental policy as a member of the European Union, and looks at the way in which attitudes shifted and shaped over time. And the basic line of argument that one encounters in the literature is that the UK has really been transformed from being in the 1970s and 80s, the dirty man of Europe, to in the sort of 1990s and early 2000s, to being a much more constructive actor in the European Union, and in some areas being a leader, particularly in relation to climate change. So the portrait of the UK as the dirty man of Europe was partly prompted by the policy style that dominated in the United Kingdom in the 1970s. So I've got a picture here of taken from Surfers Against Sewage, which is a surfer made out of feces, which I think is a really good image for getting over the sort of the challenge that surfers face when they go out into the seas of the United Kingdom and elsewhere in the world. So the sort of the dominant approach to pollution in the 1970s was something called dilute and disperse. This was a sort of the policy principle underpinning our approach to pollution control. So when it came to sewage, the idea was that we dilute our sewage and then build really long pipes out into the North Sea and the Irish Sea and disperse the diluted sewage through those pipes. So it could be carried away on currents and become somebody else's problem. So the Irish, the French, Belgians, etc. Similarly with air quality control, we sought to deal with local air pollution incidents by developing coal-fired power plants that sat outside of big urban conurbations, and we built really tall pipes that would carry away sulfur dioxide emissions on the prevailing winds. Unfortunately, they would condense and then fall elsewhere as acid rain. So we had this terrible reputation as a country that pumped raw sewage out into the seas surrounding our island and pumped out sulfur dioxide emissions, causing acid rain elsewhere in the world. And there's a book by a man called Chris Rose, who used to work for Friends of the Earth, called The Dirty Man of Europe, where he gives a sort of detailed account of these and other policies. So when we joined the European Union, we faced a number of challenges. The first was that these policy, the approach that we had to policy came under almost immediate challenge, and we encountered the fact that we had a very different style of policy making and engagement with the industries that we were regulating from that which was emerging in the European Union, largely led by Germany. And there's a great book by Rudy Wurzel that compares the UK, Germany and EU, looking at those debates around styles of policy in those early years of UK membership of the European Union in the 70s and 80s. You'll be unsurprised to hear that when the UK joined the EU, there was a degree of arrogance about our environmental policy style, this sort of sense of superiority, that actually we didn't have anything to learn from the European Union. We'd adopted the Clean Air Act in the 1950s. We had advanced nature protection laws. And so there were sort of clashes within council, and it rapidly became apparent that the UK government had misunderstood the costs of EU policy when we joined the EU, and that actually we were going to be required to implement these policies that had been adopted at European level, and it was going to be expensive, and that we'd also misunderstood the rules of the game. So for the first few years, the experience of the UK in the Environment Council was that we were very oppositional. We faced legal action from the Court of Justice. And it was only really when we get to the late 80s, early 1990s, you see sort of a growing awareness within the Department of the Environment, actually, maybe we need to learn how to play this game better. And what we've noticed is we're being required to implement rules that have been designed for the German policy system, and that doesn't really work for the UK policy system. So rather than just being confrontational within the council, maybe what we need to do is start shaping the type of policy that the EU is adopting to minimise the cost of implementation for us down the line. So that dawning realisation leads to a different sort of a shift within the UK's engagement with the EU in the environmental sphere, and sort of the emergence of the UK to some extent as being a sort of a good, or at least a better, European. So we see some attempts from the UK to try and upload our own domestic style of policy to the EU level. So the UK Management and Audit Scheme was a UK policy innovation. We piloted the emissions trading scheme in the UK ahead of that being adopted. And there was a discourse around the use of market-based instruments and around deregulation that the UK started to promulgate at the European level. We also saw the adoption in the UK of the Climate Change Act in 2008, and that was seen as a good example, and the UK was seen as one of the leaders within climate discussions in Council. I've got a picture here of David Cameron. This is when he was leader of the opposition, when he decided that the way to detoxify the Conservative brand, which had been, the Conservatives had been identified as the nasty party, and he wanted to try and change that. And he thought the one way to do that was to embrace the environment as an issue. So this is quite often described in UK journalistic circles as his hug a husky phase. So he went off to the North Pole, got this great photo opportunity, presumably flew, but we'll forget that. There's been many other crimes since. And what we see here is the Conservatives trying to position themselves as being very proactive and positive on the environment. So he supported the Climate Change Act, for example. But what we also see is a tension emerging, because within Conservative Party circles, there's also a discourse emerging around the UK gold plating EU legislation when it implements it, so going further than it needs to. And a discourse around, actually, we've got all this policy that we'd like to get rid of, but we can't because it's EU policy. And this is rumbling away in the background. So when the Conservatives were elected in 2010, they were part of a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats. So there's some real tensions there within that coalition government, as the Liberal Democrats are very pro-European, and the Conservative Party has a very Eurosceptic wing, and also is being flanked on the right by the United Kingdom Independence Party. So it's within that context that David Cameron announced in January 2013 that if he was successful in winning the next election, he would hold a referendum, an in-out referendum on the UK's membership of the EU. He went ahead and secured a majority in the election in 2015, and the rest is history. He announced a referendum in February 2016. We had that election in June and voted to leave the European Union. During the referendum campaign, the environment did not feature at all, which is quite interesting given the sort of the repositioning of the Conservatives as being a sort of a pro-environment party. So post the referendum though, oh, there we go, hang on. Post the referendum, it became much more of an issue for a number of reasons. So environmental non-governmental organisations were really worried about the implications of Brexit for UK environmental policy. So if we accept that UK environmental policy had been heavily Europeanised, there was genuine concern that leaving the EU would mean that policy would be rolled back and weakened, particularly given this discourse around the UK gold plating its implementation of environmental legislation and the need to deregulate and get rid of some of this European legislation, which was seen particularly as being problematic for house building and development. So there was genuine concern that environmental protections would be weakened. So I've got a picture here from a report from Friends of the Earth about don't let our environmental protections fall off a cliff. And there were a number of factors that were identified by environmental NGOs and experts and parliamentarians, areas of concern about how the UK's environmental policy paradigm would be affected post-Brexit. So the first referred to the governance gap. So this is the idea that as a member of the European Union, we had a whole set of monitoring and reporting requirements that would no longer be there. And in the event that the government failed to implement policy effectively, the Commission could take action and could ultimately lead to action in front of the Court of Justice. So there was concern about that governance architecture would be lost, both in terms of the reporting and monitoring requirements, but also the ultimate implementation and enforcement sanctions. There was also concern that outside of the EU, the government would weaken its ambition and long-term targets. One of the benefits of EU membership for many environment ministers is that when you lose battles domestically in your cabinet at home, you can go to the European level and be surrounded by like-minded environment ministers and secure policies that you couldn't secure domestically. And there's a great piece of work by Sebastian Prinzon on venue shopping, where he uses the Fisheries and Environment Councils as case studies to illustrate the way in which the European Union can be used to set these more ambitious targets, because it's insulated a little bit from those short-term electoral considerations that ministers within member states face. So it was a genuine concern that we wouldn't see the ambition and long-term targets being adopted domestically that we had seen being adopted at the European level. There was also a concern about our losing the ability to access the European Environment Agency, the European Chemicals Agency, the European Food Standards Agency, and so on and so forth, and having to sort of invest in expertise within our own state that we'd previously been able to draw upon by pooling that expertise with other states. And then another factor that really came to the fore, again after the vote, although some of us were talking about it during the referendum campaign, was the impact of the devolution settlements intercepting with Brexit. So the devolution settlements had been agreed in the late 1990s, and under these settlements, the governments in the devolved nations of the United Kingdom have responsibility for environmental policy. When we were a member of the European Union, that didn't really have a major impact in that the EU set the rules, and then the devolved nation states were able to decide whether or not to push further than the EU or just to implement the EU rules. So as we came out of the European Union, the question became who was going to be setting rules in the devolved nation states. And the devolved states said, we'll be setting our own rules, thank you very much. And the UK government sort of was caught on the hop a little bit, having assumed that maybe it would be setting the rules. And for environmental policy, some areas are devolved, but some areas rest with central government. So that has been a site of conflict, particularly given that we have a Scottish National Party government in Scotland at the moment that's committed to independence, and a Conservative government in London. And I won't go into devolution in more detail now, because one, I could do a whole course on it, and there are others who are more expert on it than I am. So, in response to these concerns, Theresa May, then Prime Minister, made quite an astute move. She appointed Michael Gove, who's a very competent minister, to take over as Secretary of State for the Environment. And Gove came in and took a number of quick moves to try and assuage the concerns of environmental, non-governmental organisations. So the first thing he did was push the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs to produce its 25-year environment plan, setting some of those long-term targets and ambitions. The 25-year environment plan had been a little bit of a joke up to that point, that everyone said it was called that because it was taking 25 years to write it, because we kept waiting for it and it wasn't being produced. So first thing Gove did was get the 25-year environment plan published. The second thing he did was recognise that, yes, there did need to be a move to replace some of that lost governance architecture and move to have an environment bill brought forward. That has been back and forth several times, but was finally adopted the week before last. So we now have an Environment Act, which has established an Office for Environmental Protection, which will pick up some of those functions around monitoring and implementation and enforcement, although the criticism is it's not independent enough and it doesn't have sufficient powers, but it plugs some of that gap. We also have an Agriculture Act and a Fisheries Act to address some of the gaps that might have emerged there. But crucially, we got this claim that to try and head off criticism, that post-EU, the UK will be an environmental superpower. So that's quite, and what does that mean to be an environmental superpower? What will that look like? Oops. So that prompted me to reflect on, okay, what does it mean to be an environmental superpower? What does it mean to be an environmental leader? There's a vast literature out there on environmental leadership, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but I've pulled out 3 core characteristics that one might expect for a state to be able to claim that it's a superpower or leader. The first is that you should be exemplary in some way, shape or form, and be a bit of a forerunner. So be setting a good example to other states by setting more ambitious targets or innovating in a particular way so that states might want to follow you. But that needs to be credible. You can't just make claims and then not deliver on them. So that would be the second component. And then the third one, you need to inspire followers. So leadership requires followership. And there are different ways to do that, but one very effective way is to use your diplomatic and soft power, particularly if you don't have much in the way of structural power. And even when it comes to environmental policy making, diplomatic and soft power can often be more important. And there's a wonderful piece by Karen Backstrand and Olle Elgström looking at the European Union's failures at COP, the Copenhagen COP in 2009, where it tried to lead and then looked behind and realised that nobody was following it. And so changed its strategy after that COP in the run-up to the Durban COP in 2011, where the EU was regarded as being very effective as a leader. And what it did successfully between Copenhagen and Durban was engage in what Bertrand and Elgstrom call leadiation. So it took a leadiator strategy, where yes, it tried to set a good example, but it used its diplomatic and soft power to negotiate with the states whose behaviour it wanted to shape to bring them with it. So it seems to me these are the kinds of behaviours that we should be looking for if we're trying to determine if a country is an environmental leader or not. If we turn to the UK's positioning on the international stage post-Brexit, there's this sort of tag, Global Britain, which recognises that the context that the UK finds itself in has changed because it's got to sort of reposition itself post-EU. And there are a number of sort of planks to this strategy, but it's worth pointing out that what the government is wanting to do is maintain the UK's global standing and status, and wants to demonstrate that the UK is open, outward-looking and confident on the world stage. And COP26 offered an opportunity to deliver on this. And the Global Britain strategy document includes, unsurprisingly, some specific targets on climate change and on biodiversity, in reflection of the fact that you had the forthcoming COP26, and then we have the Convention on Biological Diversity COP, which was supposed to be in 2020, but is now in 2022 as well. So the sort of the targets identified in the Global Britain strategy is that we need to accelerate the UK's transition to net zero by 2050, accelerate the global transition to net zero, and seek to strengthen adaptation, both domestically and further afield. And underpinning that, have a successful COP26, right? That's what's going to show that we're a confident nation bestriding the world stage, shaping what others do. And the aims for COP26 were relatively, I don't want to say unambitious, but were reined in a little bit to reflect the context, that we're post-context, we're post-COVID, well, we're not post-COVID, that we had a pandemic with lockdowns and now we have variable lockdowns globally, and that countries were facing economic hardship coming out of the pandemic for those that were, and that would necessarily restrict the ambition at COP and maybe the achievements at COP. So the principal aims were to address the emissions gap through keeping 1.5 alive, so to try and keep that 1.5 degree target in reach, to address the finance gap. So there was a commitment made in Copenhagen to get states to raise $100 billion a year towards climate finance, and we still haven't yet reached that. So I think the OECD had a report the year before last which showed that it was still less than 80 billion a year being raised by states towards finance, climate finance, and to try and rebalance the focus of the COPs towards adaptation, because there are countries now that are already dealing with the consequences of global warming, where there's a real need to think about channeling finance and innovation towards adaptation for those states. So those were the kind of principal aims for COP26. So if we go back to my sort of relatively simplistic, what are the sort of the three characteristics of a leader? The first one I identified was that you should be a forerunner. And here I think the UK can make some claims towards setting a good example and being a bit of a forerunner. So yes, we adopted the Climate Change Act back in 2008, and that has inspired some other states to look at adopting a Climate Change Act. We've started to move beyond coal, so coal will no longer be used to generate electricity in the UK post-2024. The House of Commons adopted a climate emergency declaration early on in May 2019. We are one of the first kind of major developed economies to adopt a net zero target back in July 2019. In November 2020, the government adopted a 10-point green industrial plan to create 250,000 green jobs. And here you get a flavour of the kinds of things that the government wants to focus its net zero transition on. So using renewable energy, using nuclear power, making the transition to electric vehicles, supporting industries to become greener in zero emission planes and ships. I will come back to that. Becoming a world leader in carbon capture and technology, planting lots of trees, and making the City of London a global centre of green finance. So these are the kinds of things that the government sees as being central to its net zero strategy. And that net zero strategy was published in October, shortly ahead of COP26. So there's definitely some evidence of the UK government being prepared to act in a way that one would expect from environmental leaders. But the next critical question is it credible or not? So I've got a cartoon here from Ben Jennings in The Guardian, which made me laugh. So I thought I would share it with you with, Boris Johnson turned up to COP26 in Glasgow and then got a flight to London, which, yeah, he's not the only one who did that. And there's been quite a lot of commentary about that. But given he lives in the UK and there is quite a good train service from Glasgow to London, he might have wanted to think about the optics of then hopping on a plane. So are these plans credible? When you look beneath the surface, they start to look slightly less impressive. So the 10-point plan really recycled a set of existing commitments. The net zero strategy has been welcomed by environmental NGOs as a really important step in the right direction, but there are some big holes in there. And it's very optimistic about the capacity of private capital to step in and fund some of these big investments. So, for example, the idea that we're going to have emission-free planes anytime soon seems to be very, very optimistic. Crucially, there's clearly a split between Number 10 and the Treasury is not on board with Number 10's climate change plans and has pointed out, for example, that as we make the transition to electric vehicles, that will leave a £30 billion hole in our tax revenues from fossil fuels. And there don't seem to be any moves to try and plug that gap at the moment, except through attracting private finance. It's also the case that the Treasury is very worried about carbon leakage. So the idea that companies will go and set up elsewhere if they think doing business in the UK is going to be too expensive. We've also seen some mixed signals. So there's this big talk about moving away from coal. Meanwhile, the government has approved a new coal field in Cumbria. It's approved some licenses for oil exploration just off Shetland in the North Sea Cambo oil field. And then in the budget, which came shortly after the net zero strategy was published, we cut taxes on domestic air flights and invested money in a new roads programme. None of that, so there seems to be an inconsistency here. There isn't that credibility. The other area where the government has come under a lot of criticism has been around overseas development assistance, where we've cut our funding. So if you want to inspire other countries to follow you, both in making funds available, but also you want to get countries who are typically regarded as the moral voices of the COP to be on side, probably best not to cut the funding that you're offering them shortly before that meeting is held. And given that those limitations around the strategy, that raises questions about the UK government's ability to inspire followers. I've got a picture here of Alok Sharma, who I think actually had a good COP. I think he was regarded as being quite credible diplomatically. And here he's sort of been in all the press that he was sort of fighting back tears when we saw the last minute change to the final text of the COP agreement to phase down rather than phase out coal. Now, there's two ways of looking at that, right? We've never really had explicit mention of fossil fuels or coal before this meeting. So actually including anything looks like an advance, but it's a shame that it went from phasing out to phasing down. We saw India agree to a net zero target for 2070. Again, there's two ways to look at that. One is that this is fantastic. India's agreed a target for net zero. The other is actually it's not enough and it needs to be a target for 2050. And again, there's been quite a live debate in the press about whether or not it's reasonable to ask India to commit more earlier, given that compared to some other countries, it's still got a long way to go in terms of developing its economy. We certainly saw the importance of structural power at this conference. So this was the first COP where America has re-engaged, which poses lots of interesting counterfactual questions about what would the British position have been ahead of the COP if Trump had won the election, and how might it have turned out if Trump was still around. But that's maybe a sort of an imaginary to be written at a different point. But what you clearly see is that China and the US are still the really big important players in international diplomacy, and they didn't exercise that power to try and push things further and faster. And it's clear that Johnson doesn't have a good relationship with Biden. He doesn't have a good relationship with Xi Jinping, who didn't attend. So there doesn't seem to be much evidence that the British government has been able to inspire followers. And the outcome of the COP, on the one hand, there are some positives, but the BBC has suggested that the outcome from this COP means that temperatures will be limited to between somewhere like 1.8 and 2.4 degrees this century. And we all know that that's absolutely catastrophic for some countries, and it's not yet enough. And there's been an agreement to meet again next year to try and get states to come forward with some more ambitious targets under their nationally determined contributions. So a sort of, I'm not going to say a better than expected COP. It could have been worse, but it wasn't fantastic in terms of outcomes. And looking to the UK, one might ask then, if we're a little bit cynical about the UK's credibility, what are the long-term prospects for the UK exercising any kind of climate leadership over the longer term? And again, there are some tensions here. On the one hand, we have some really profound structural constraints, economic constraints, because the government has borrowed an awful lot of money during the pandemic in order to offer individuals furlough and to keep the economy moving. And that will have to be paid back at some point, and there are very high interest rates, and there's a bit of a crunch coming around that level of debt. On the other hand, there's also clearly an electoral case for engaging with climate change politics. So in the 2019 election, regularly about a quarter of the UK population identified climate change as a top 3 issue for them. And that interest and level of concern has remained fairly constant. Previously, you would see that peak and then it would drop off again, but actually it seems to be remaining fairly constant. We had a climate assembly in the UK, and that report is really interesting because what that reveals is that citizens, particularly having been through a climate assembly process, are very much in favour of taking action to address net zero, but they're very uncomfortable with some of the more difficult trade-offs. So what comes out of this climate assembly report is that the people involved want to see the government taking net zero seriously, but they want any policies that are adopted to be fair. So if you're going to be saying that people need to fly less, then that needs to be targeted at the people who fly most and who are richer. It shouldn't be targeted at poor, hardworking families who only go on holiday every 2 years, and that's the thing that they're saving for and looking forward to. The report also emphasises the need to respect freedom. And this is interesting when you come to one of the obvious things that we could do to try and cut emissions is to change the way that we eat and to eat less meat. There is an unwillingness to grasp that particular nettle in government circles, so that's not mentioned in the net zero strategy. And what comes out of the Climate Assembly report is, again, this sort of unwillingness to see people having their freedom of choice restricted in a significant way. The other sort of challenge, I think, for the net zero transition in the UK is this optimistic reliance upon market actors coming forward and technological innovation being able to drive the transition forward. Now, it is certainly the case that innovation in the field of renewable energy, for example, has made a huge difference in us being able to achieve cutting emissions. But for a long-term strategy, if you want to have that kind of technological innovation, at some point you need to be investing and you need to be coordinating and you need to have a properly detailed plan. And we haven't yet seen that come forth from the government in the kinds of detail that are required to convince me, and I think a lot of others, that we will be able to to convince me, a lot of others, and crucially the Climate Change Committee, which is an independent, very credible expert body that comments on these things, that the plans in place will deliver the kinds of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that we need to see. So market or environmental superpower, maybe somewhere in between, I think. So yes, we clearly have adopted some ambitious targets and been a forerunner in that respect, but actually a lot of those don't look that credible upon closer inspection. And I don't think we've really got any followers at this point, but I'm happy to be proved wrong and told that France is keen to follow the UK wherever it would choose to lead, as long as it doesn't involve any fishing boats. So to conclude, COP26 in week 1 did look like a potential disaster for the UK. So everyone arrived, the trains weren't running because there'd been some kind of incident. So lots of people ended up having to fly. It being Britain, there were queues everywhere and it was very cold and wet because this was in Glasgow. There was an Israeli delegate who was in a wheelchair who went to the wrong entrance apparently and was made to wait for ages and then was told that she couldn't come in. So it did look like it was going to be an absolute catastrophe. It turned out better than I think I was anticipating and a lot of people were anticipating. I think the UK diplomatic machine worked quite effectively and I think Sharma did a reasonable job. But longer term, there is a very clear risk that the UK will not meet these ambitious commitments that it set. I think we will see some leadership and innovation in key sectors, particularly around EVs, so making that shift in car ownership, but I think we'll see some patchy implementation. And I think one of the challenges we face, if we come back to the Muppet trope, is that Boris Johnson likes rhetoric and he likes infrastructure and he likes bright, shiny, exciting projects, but he doesn't like being unpopular. So he came to the UN General Assembly and said, you know, Kermit the Frog said it isn't easy being green, but it is. But actually he's wrong. It isn't easy to be green. It's expensive and it requires planning and coordination and serious politicians who are prepared to say, actually, this will be challenging, but if we don't do it, the alternative is a lot worse. And I don't think that he is the politician for this moment, which is disappointing for the UK, but hopefully there is another politician on the world stage who is prepared to bring the world with them to sort of make the case for climate change and make the case that actually this will be challenging, but it's really important because if we don't do it, the cost will be higher, both at a at individual personal level, but also in financial terms for states. So Richard mentioned at the beginning, Brexit and environment. We have lots of evidence and reports on that website of all our contributions to the Brexit debates, and we publish regular blogs. So do go and have a look. I just got an email literally before I came, so you might want to share this with people that UEA is about to advertise 3 PhD scholarships on climate change. So I've got the link there. I'll give you the slides so that you can share that more broadly. And then I've just got some of the literature I mentioned and some of the reports I mentioned. And I will stop talking now and maybe hand over to you, France.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Extremely informative and thoughtful for all of us. So Florence, whenever you're ready, please.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for this presentation because I think it brings together two incredibly important issues of today. Some of the hottest, one could say, issues that we need to grapple with in the UK and also in the EU, Brexit and climate. And thank you for also presenting it with the Kermit the Frog and and all the rest. As I was thinking about how to respond and how to structure what I wanted to discuss, I thought I would actually focus in 2 dimensions. you talked about global Britain, and of course I want to talk about it, but I think it's interesting to also talk about parochial Britain, and that's what I want to start with. And you, it was very good of you to remind us of the dirty mine of Europe and the transformation that environmental policies have been in the UK, and the passage from being lagging behind to actually playing an important role in the EU in terms of environmental policy. It's and it is actually because of the role that the UK has led in terms of these environmental policies. It's one of the reasons why the environment was at the heart of the Brexit negotiations, partly because it raises a lot of issues. Now, of course, environmental policies are important for the EU, and because a lot of the policies have been moved on, as you explained, to the European level, in particular because it's a good way to then impose it to reluctant countries. And as the EU has enlarged, there has been more and more reluctant countries. And the UK has been very good at actually exerting pressure on that. But it's also important because environmental policy makes it possible to level the playing field, as the expression goes, to an extent. And it's because of its importance for leveling the playing field that it had to be on the agenda. And it's one of the reasons why there has been a lot of anxiety about the UK retrenching or downgrading or degrading its environmental policy. And a good deal of anxiety has been precisely directed at that, whether rightly or wrongly. But it's been there, and it's been, and this fear has been encouraged by the fact that Brexiteers have not been very good at sounding extremely pro-environmental. And in their criticism of the EU as being about over-regulation and freeing the UK from the shackles of Europe, it included very prominently all this environmental legislation. And when Theresa May took the decision to opt out of both the single market and the customs union, of course, it makes these constraints even more important. You pointed to the fact that environmental policy in the UK will be devolved or is devolved, and that a lot of the legislation that is thus adopted in Westminster actually only applies to England. And this leaves open a number of questions in terms of the direction of policy, both in the devolved nations, but also in England, particularly because so long as the Conservative Party dominates Westminster, one can fear that there will be more talk about and thinking about whether it's easy or not being green, and a little less on the action side. So there are two points I want to ask you to develop maybe a little further, because I think it's something that it would be good to know more from my perspective. I mean, I used to work a lot in British politics. I do so a little less now. And I'm curious to know what you think. The first one is on joins to your credibility argument, and in particular the credibility that we need to give to the Conservative Party and to the Johnson government, because as as you mentioned, Cameron might have been hugging huskies in 2005, but by 2013 he wanted to get rid of the green crap, and the very nice tree that replaced the Conservative logo, probably still expects to be planted somewhere. So, and also we know that there has been a number of prominent Conservative Party members and leaders and so on who have been and probably still are climato-sceptic. I don't know how one pronounces this, but anyway. So, to what extent do you think one can believe, trust, but at least believe, and to which extent the commitment of the Conservative Party to not downgrade its environmental policy, and in particular in some of the dimensions that were feared in terms of farming, in terms of habitat, in terms of sewage and pollution, and we know that 3 weeks ago now there was this issue about sewage again in the UK, but also linked to that and is the downgrading of the HS2 plan. So basically, a government who almost in the same week announces that, or claims that it wants to decarbonate and blah blah blah, at the same time pushes people off trains and back into their car, into airplanes. So the second, so first the Conservative Party, the second is on pressure from public opinion. One could imagine that the Conservative Party now has or is trying to combine an electoral base that combines the traditional business support with maybe the red wall. And the red wall is likely to fear what we call in France écologie punitive, all the, you were talking about one holiday in the sun every 2 years or whatever. So to what extent does that electoral base constrain or limit the ambition of the Conservatives? The second point is linked to remembering what had happened in the 1990s when the previous Conservative government, building from the 80s and so on, but when it really triggered a lot of non-violent direct action and movement. So I'm wondering to which extent we're on the edge of, and it started in a way with the Extinction Rebellion, but we're on the edge of seeing a reactivation of this potential for protest. So what do you think about that? The third question I have on again on civil society and so on is linked to the role of the very powerful association NGOs that the UK has had, and that from the 1990s have turned a lot of their attention to lobbying Brussels. So I'm thinking about organizations such as the RSPB and so on, which have lobbied both Westminster but also the EU, and presumably now they need to reshift the focus, and is it that what they're doing indeed, reshifting focus to the UK? So are they renationalizing? And I have just maybe probably too many questions. Richard, you'll have to stop me. Because I also want to ask you about whether the opposition is as silent on the environment as it is on Brexit, because I mean, really, they don't seem to be there. And I also want to ask I hope we'll have a chance to talk more about the Climate Assembly, because I'm wondering the extent to which it's been used by the UK government, a bit like in France, to try and find sources of legitimacy to, offload some of the responsibility of taking difficult decisions and unpopular decisions, and shying away when actually does get that support, or not getting the benefits, as you seem to be explaining the case of the Climate Assembly. Okay, I want now to, if Richard allows me, to carry on and turn to talking about global Britain. Because I want to think also about what the EU is losing, as it's losing the UK, and what it's losing from an environmental perspective. In your presentation, you talked about the diplomatic role, which clearly has been super important, and a question that arises with Brexit is directly linked to whether the UK can maintain, despite its claim, its global reach, because it may want to be more global by getting outside of the EU, but at the same time, its weight in the world is diminished. So the COP26 in a way didn't particularly strike me as demonstrating that the UK has or can have the leadership that it aspires to, or at least it claimed to have. Is there, do you see reasons for more optimism beyond COP in this direction? Now, of course, for COP, expectations had been reduced, and the British government really benefited from, in a way, paradoxically, from COVID and from all the excuses that came with it. That allowed it probably to also befuzzle the public about the fact that Alok Sharma, even though he did very well, was probably not the out of the blue best, out of the green best person to lead an environmental negotiation. As far as I understand, there's nothing really in his past, apart from being a business minister, that really qualifies him. And I think that's really important, because it really also emphasizes the importance on business and market, on facing the market in different ways, that has characterized the Conservative Party and the British position, but also Brexit. Right, I'm going to move towards a few questions, more specific questions. So the first one is, to what extent do you think that the quite mixed outcome of COP, to what extent do you think it's denting the UK's reputation, or is it sufficiently mixed that it can actually compensate from the dented reputation because of the the tensions around keeping to the rule of law internationally and abiding by Brexit agreements and so on? And my second point is that I think there's a lot of games of that are being, it's too strong to say games that are being played, but the British government seems to be trying to control the public agenda by shifting attention to different places, and in particular when there's something damaging happening somewhere else, shifting attention by prompting up something else. So I'm wondering whether the COP distracts from Brexit, whether the fish war distracts from COP, whether the COP distracts from COVID, and whether COVID distracts from the Brexit that is coming back in to haunt us in the next few weeks. So I'll stop here. I have a lot of other questions, but I'll stop here. Thank you so much for this really, really interesting presentation.
Thank you very much, Florence. Charlotte, do you want to address or pick up some of these points of this very extensive comment and set of questions?
Yeah, happily. And when I was doing the talk, I was thinking about all the things that I was excluding, many of which you've picked up on, Florence, particularly around the trade and cooperation agreement and issues around non-regression. And thank you for pointing out, yes, that I should have said the Office for Environmental Protection, 25-year Environment Plan, the Environment Act, they only apply to England, and we have different arrangements in place for, well, sorry, some of it applies to Northern Ireland, and we have different arrangements in place for Scotland and Wales. So what I will do is probably turn to your questions on ENGOs lobbying Brussels. Yes, I think there's been a major existential crisis for a lot of those environmental non-governmental organisations that focus a lot of their activity at the European level. They're also facing some funding issues where they were beneficiaries of EU funding and now that funding has gone. So yes, they are having to retarget their focus on the UK. And once Brexit was done, we see Greener UK actually really focusing all its activities on the adoption of the Environment Act. And I think it will be interesting to see over the longer term how those organisations reposition themselves within a purely UK context. Many of them are still, of course, members of wider organisations. So the RSPB is affiliated with BirdLife International, Friends of the Earth sits within Friends of the Earth Europe. But certainly from talking to people working in the sector, what you've also seen is that the EU sort of arms, the European arms of those organisations have moved on and are busy engaging with different things, whereas in the UK, we're still slightly dealing with our post-Brexit trauma. So yes, I think it shifted focus and I think those organisations are aware that they're just now going to have a lot of work to do. Now the Environment Act has been adopted, having targeted lobbying activity on that, there's going to be a need to start targeting activity on is it being implemented properly? And thank you, I meant to mention the sewage crisis. So having sort of said dirty man of Europe in the 1970s and 80s, and we're still having debates about the wonderful dilute and disperse policy at the moment in the UK, where there's been a big debate around sewage, where the government basically went, well, we can't possibly deal with this, it will cost too much money. Like, yes, but I think you'll find that the general public isn't very keen on raw sewage floating in rivers and seas. So you asked me if the opposition has been as silent on the environment as it has been on Brexit. It has to be said that the opposition has been quite invisible. Boris Johnson is quite good at outmanoeuvring them, and you think they'd be catching up with that. Ed Miliband, I think, is one of the most effective Labour politicians on environmental and climate issues. So he is very effective when he speaks on it. But yeah, we're still waiting to see what Labour sort of still hasn't really fully set out its stall. And I know that we're not in election territory just yet, but I think they do need to start doing a bit more work to be reaching the public. And one of the challenges that you mentioned around public opinion and around the Conservative Party is this question of the red wall seats. Where I think, and you mentioned HS2, so there's been a lot of pushback from the red wall seats. So for those who aren't familiar, the red wall seats are traditional Labour seats, typically in the north of England, which went to the Conservatives last time, for the first time ever, many of them. I think Boris Johnson's hope is that he has a thing that he calls the levelling up agenda. So those seats are largely pre-industrial seats. They tend to have lower levels of income than many than sort of the southeast of England, sort of around London. And so the idea is to try and level up those areas to bring investment to them and to create jobs. And so there's been an attempt to sort of try and marry the levelling up agenda with the Green Industrial Revolution agenda. HS2 was supposed to be part of that package, and now that's just been walked away from, which does raise question marks about how is he going to keep red wall seats on side if there isn't going to be that investment in jobs in those areas, and if there isn't going to be that investment on green jobs, what kinds of jobs are going to be created? So I think there is a genuine potential tension there. I think there is also the scope, though, for happy marriage between, okay, if our industrial strategy is going to be an environmental industrial strategy, then you can develop new technologies in those areas. And one could point to Grimsby in the north of England on the coast, which used to be a major fishing port, but now is a major site for renewable technologies, for example. So we've got a sort of a wind farm off the coast. So there is some scope there for those two agendas to sit happily with each other, but it requires coordination, and it requires investment, and it requires planning, and none of that seems to be in evidence yet. And then I'm trying to see what else you asked me about. Is the British government controlling the public agenda by shifting blame? Yes. And I had that picture of, Brexit's happened. Who are we going to blame for all our problems now? Well, it turns out the European Union and France are still good to go when it comes to blaming them for any problems we have, or as you say, shifting attention. The other thing that's happening in the UK context is there will be costs associated with Brexit, but they're being smuggled out as costs associated with COVID. So again, COVID has been useful for the Prime Minister in a number of ways, as well as being extraordinarily expensive and devastating for public finances and for individuals. It has provided somewhere to hide some other bad news. It can be smuggled under the COVID blanket. So, and you asked me, what is the EU losing? I mean, I have to say, if I were you, I think not very much, given the current. No, I'm joking. I suppose I tend to think in terms of what we've lost. I think from the EU's, but I think my hope is over the longer term, if I think about from an environment and climate perspective, what the EU may be losing, I anticipate that the EU isn't losing the UK as a diplomatic partner or access to that diplomatic expertise, for the simple reason that I think from an environmental and climate perspective, there will be a shared agenda. I think at the moment, in the short term, it will be difficult to have that kind of cooperation and coordination, except at the civil servant level. But over the longer term, I would hope there will be a recognition that it is in our shared interest to work collectively. And we've seen this week the incidents of the Belarusian and Polish border, sort of the Russian shenanigans there and Belarusian activity. That is clearly a shared agenda for the UK and the European Union. So I would hope some common sense and grown-up politics eventually come to bear. And I think my experience of talking with civil servants and policymakers at the European level and the UK level is that actually the relationships at sort of civil servant level are still pretty good. It's just that sometimes at sort of that executive level, France has got an election coming up. Shortly we'll have an election coming up in the UK. So there's all kinds of nonsense that goes on at those stages. But below that, I think there's hopefully still some mutual respect and some shared goals. So hopefully you're not losing too much. Can we maintain our global reach? No, we're a tiny state. We've got delusions of grandeur. Those of us who've been studying British foreign policy for years, kind of are well aware that this sort of grandstanding about what a great power we are is evidence of some delusions of grandeur and inability to face up to Britain's role in the world. And we saw that painful discovery in the 1970s, which led to us applying to join, or 1960s and 70s, which led to us applying to join the European Union. But apparently we've forgotten that at some point. I'm sure we'll realise again. And may well come back in sort of 20 years' time, going, actually, knock, knock, can we come back in, please? I might be wrong on that. So I'll stop talking there, because I think you said you had to leave early, and I can see that you had a few points to make. Sorry, Richard, I should let you chair rather than taking over.
No, that's fine. Thank you. You're perfectly right. Thank you for your answers. And probably it's a good thing if we turn to if we open the floor more generally now. So Joost, if you want to start, you're most welcome.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Charlotte, for a very interesting presentation. Very clear, very funny as well. So that's always nice to start a Monday with a insightful yet light presentation. Okay, so I had a few comments, but I'll try to, as well as questions, I'll try to frame them around, I'll try to make a sort of single narrative around them. And I think the question is a bit the question of sort of how do we evaluate leadership? What kind of criteria do we use for them? And I think you've gone for one approach, which is, I guess, focusing on the internal coherence of the promises made. But I guess a more radical approach would question whether those self-proclaimed goals are even worth pursuing. So the first thing that came to mind is this discussion that has been going on, I think, in the context of British self-proclaimed leadership, namely that it focuses on production and not on consumption. So that discussion has, of course, been going on for a long time. But then specifically in the context of COP26, I went to the COP26 counter summit. So I have some of the critiques of British and global NGOs of the whole net zero strategy quite fresh in memory. And I think that they are so critical of the net zero strategy that they would even rather see it being internally incoherent than being internally coherent. Where, for instance, they argue out, the whole net zero strategy being built around the strategy of offsetting, which doesn't really do much to cutting emissions, but mainly focuses on moving them around or moving around accounting exercises. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar to those arguments. Same for nature-based solutions. I think also when we look at that 10 action plan, that then actually many of I think there's hardly anything on there that would cut emissions. A lot of the promises are around energy vectors, not so much energy sources like hydrogen, etc. So anyway, I'm sure that this is all familiar to you and to most people here, so I don't need to repeat all of that. But I was just wondering, sort of, okay, if we talk about leaders, especially when we talk about leadership and about is this something to follow, then I just thought this was important to mention and perhaps to make it a bit more constructive. Sort of, how do you see bridging that debate, the more critical, radical debate, which perhaps might seem a bit far off, sort of having policy relevance, and making this kind of more policy close evaluation? Is there a way to approach this in a more constructive way, where these two ways of looking at it can speak to each other? Then related to that, there seems to be, and there has been going on in the UK, I think, for a long time, maybe already since the UK Climate Act, a bit of a contestation around real environmentalism and false environmentalism, with, obviously, I mean, Florence mentioned Extinction Rebellion. They emerged from the UK for a reason. It's not because the UK has been doing so well, or at least from the points of view that I've just mentioned. And I was wondering whether Brexit can be seen as having entrenched that difference, whether it has made it more difficult to make, well, to reach across that divide, if you want. Because I think, I don't know precisely, but I would, and that's perhaps my question, is, do the cleavages that Brexit represent, do they follow the same lines as that real versus false environmentalism cleavage follow? And thus, has the Brexit debate deepened that trench, making it more difficult to reach across? Then a final point, but maybe for the sake of time, we can see whether you want to address it or not, is the question of how a discussion around energy independence fits in this whole thing, energy independence, and perhaps this somewhat surprising banning on fracking in that context. I mean, of course, the Conservatives didn't like that, but it still happened. But it seems to be somewhat of doesn't seem to fit with the UK independence narrative, where I think fracking was often promoted as this fuel that would allow the UK to stay independent post-Brexit. And I guess that links also to the whole Scotland independence discussion with Scottish oil, and so everything is related. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you for some great questions. Yeah, I mean, the net zero strategy, I've been ranting about that since about 2008, about how net zero doesn't actually make any sense, and we do still produce emissions. It's just we're offsetting them. And yeah, I mean, obviously, and there's that whole debate around green colonialism as well. I don't think that obviously sits well with the government. And so this, I suppose, becomes an interesting question in the context of where is the opposition on these issues, because I can't see those more radical debates entering into the political mainstream from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party at the moment because of the voters that they're seeking to attract. So it would really have to come from the Green Party, I suspect. Sorry, the Labour Party a few years ago under Jeremy Corbyn, maybe that would have been a space for those sort of more radical debates. But even then, I suspect not, because on the one hand, the Conservative wants to keep business on side. On the other hand, Labour wants to keep Labour on side, which means having a particular take on how to get the economy working. And you asked about whether or not Brexit has sort of entrenched those differences between that sort of more radical take on the environment and real or false environmentalism. And arguably, yes, it has, because the people who voted for Brexit, I mean, it's a little bit complicated, but there are some broad brush findings which generally older people from particular kinds of constituencies who have particular types of attitudes towards immigration, who might see that there's a need to do something about climate change, but probably don't want to see there being radical action. And I think, Florence, I didn't come back to your question about the Climate Assembly, and you sort of see that represented in the Climate Assembly, where there's sort of it's quite a bland document actually, where it says, yeah, we think this is a really difficult issue and we'd like government to do something about it, but actually we don't want you to take any really difficult decisions because we don't want to restrict people's freedom. And for me, that slightly represents the gap between those who have a better sense of the type of action that will be necessary in order to deal with climate change, and that it will require changes and that you do need to be radical, and the rest of the public who recognise this is something we need to address, but actually we don't want to change our life. We still want to eat beef. We still want to get in our car. We still want to fly. And so there's that challenge there. So I think there is an overlap between those who voted Remain and who are more likely to be pro-environment, and those who voted Brexit who are more likely to be cynical about climate change. And I'm not sure how to bridge that debate. And as well as Extinction Rebellion, I don't know if you've been following Insulate Britain, who are the new group who have emerged, where somebody glued their face to the motorway and then did say afterwards, yes, it didn't seem like a great idea once I was stuck to the road. It didn't seem like such a good idea anymore. So I'm not sure I've really answered your question there, Joost.
Maybe yes, I can just clarify one thing about what I had in mind with asking the question, is because you point out the debates around like who's going to pay for it, like whose privileges or whose holidays are on the line here. But what I was wondering about is whether beyond those sort of bread and butter issues, whether it's become more symbolic, whether Brexit it's probably fair to say that Brexit has made the UK more divided, and divided along symbolic lines, identity lines, bash cyclists lines, and whether that sort of has made the whole environmental discussion actually not even about more than the bread and butter issues, but actually making it simply symbolically unpalatable for a part of the population because it is associated with the other side of the Brexit debate.
So this is interesting in the context of I have a general level of cynicism about Boris Johnson, but he has this career of having been a journalist, and he's good at winning elections, and he's a very effective political operator. And he wrote an editorial in the Sun newspaper, which is one of our tabloid newspapers, to coincide with the net zero strategy, in which he came up with some, or one of his people who works for him to write these things, came up with some fantastic trope about one of the changes that we're going to need to make is that people will have to move away from having gas boilers in their homes. And that's incredibly expensive. If you think, you know, a gas boiler costs an extraordinary amount of money, and that's generating a lot of concern amongst poorer families about what am I going to have instead. And so he wrote this editorial in which he said that citizens didn't need to worry about what was it, hairy-toed sandal-wearing environmental activists coming and getting a pointy carrot to make them get rid of their beloved combi boiler, which absolutely infuriated me when I read it. But, you know, it's entertaining and it gets over the point that we want you to change your behaviour and you will have to, but we're not going to force you to do things that you don't want to. And so what we have is, as you say, a sort of a divided country, certainly divided along Brexit lines, but a Prime Minister who recognises that if we're going to have to change behaviour, some of those people who might have been Brexiteers, or who are Brexiteers, who are cynical about climate change, you have to get them on side. And he does actually have the rhetorical tools to get those people on side. The challenge is, does he have the policy that will get them and keep them on side? One of the interesting questions, if we go back to the red wall seats, I haven't seen detailed polling data on how climate change tracks in those seats, but for some of those seats, so I actually commute through one of them in Doncaster, or near Doncaster, and we've had really awful floods. So there's also that issue about you know, part of the argument that affluent people care about the environment is because the environment is a post-material issue, but we all know that the environment is actually a material issue. And when you have people in poorer constituencies paying the cost because their houses are flooded and their houses have been built on floodplains, I think then there is a case to be made. And again, despite my reservations about him, I think Boris Johnson has the scope and capacity to be able to persuade people with his power of rhetoric that actually this is something we need to care about. And that, I think, is what he's been trying to do. The question is, as I say, can he deliver over the longer term, and can he move beyond the rhetoric to actually delivering a policy plan? So I'm not sure that that's yet answers your question, Yus, but I think, does that go some way to answering it?
Definitely, yeah, close enough, definitely.
Okay, so you've now got the image of, you know, environmental activists wearing sandals with pointy carrots as well. So I'll see if I can find the piece and send it to you. It is quite funny.
Okay. Thank you very much, Charlotte, and you for this wonderful exchange between the two of you. We have a question in the chat by Jose Maria Valenzuela. Jose had to leave, I know, but I think he's pointing a very interesting question, maybe a difficult one, but very interesting for the discussion. So his question is basically, would COP26 have been different if it had been run by Italy or a member state of the European Union, or would we think the same question? Would COP26 have been different, run by or under British presidency, but Britain still the UK of the European Union? So basically, what did Brexit change to COP26? It's difficult. It's a kind of counterfactual question, but what can you tell us about it, Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and it's back to that counterfactual. As I was saying, like, you know, what would have happened if Trump had won the election? Like, what would Boris Johnson's position have been there? So ahead of the referendum, he had two pieces that he'd written, apparently, or he had two speeches when he was trying to decide if he was going to be in favour or against Brexit. And you wonder if the same is true here ahead of the US election. Did he have sort of climate change policy if Trump won, and then one if Biden won, and which one? What was the difference between them? I suspect that overall the outcomes would not have been hugely different because of those structural conditions. It may have been that we would have seen, I suppose an interesting question would be, would China have attended? I suspect not. but you know, maybe the European Union or Italy has that sort of a much better relationship with the Chinese premier and could have got Xi Jinping to come along. I'm not sure we would have seen many more ambitious NDCs being brought forward. So I'm not convinced that it would have been hugely different, but I'm actually curious to know what other people think. But my general take would be, given the context, that sort of shaped the art of the possible. So there may have been perhaps a little bit more achieved, but probably not a huge amount more. And I don't think any less would have been achieved. But I don't know. Florence, what do you think?
I have no idea. I'm trying to turn that in my head, and I don't know. But I think Jorge had raised his hand and maybe had.
Yes, it's more. It's not a really important point, but the whole problems with the trains and the airplanes wouldn't have happened. Maybe the public opinion would have been different. So maybe we would be seeing it with a whole different light. We would have seen it as a less chaotic week, and it would have been easier to conduct.
That's true, because the train system in Italy is fantastic. I'm a big fan of it. I'm sure the trains would have all run on time, and it probably wouldn't have been raining if you'd have held it in the right place. Everyone would have been happy. It would have been sunny. I think that's a really good point.
Okay.
I think the activism would have looked very different. I think the activism and the UK, even though the UK, of course, has a long direct action tradition, but it's at the moment especially focused on non-violent direct action. I think the Italians have a slightly different take on that, at least more confrontational than Extinction Rebellion. The whole Extinction Rebellion exists in the UK, but its approach to how to engage with authorities, how to engage with the police is very different and rooted in a much more confrontational history. I don't know what that would have done. I mean, we've seen in the run, there was the pre-COP or I'm not sure it was literally called a pre-COP, but in Milan, there was a kind of pre-COP meeting where the activism did escalate in some ways, and police was quite well, there was basically two demonstrations. I think there was the standard Fridays for Future one, which everybody celebrates, and then there was a more confrontational one that also occupied some buildings. Anyway, from that point of view, I think it might have looked different, and it might have put that probably wouldn't have made much of an influence on the decision-making process, but it does paint a different picture. Right now, we had, I think, a quite classical narrative with the demonstration at the beginning, saying we need action, putting the focus on the negotiations, painting social movements as being about putting pressure on negotiations. I think in Italy, there might have been a more rupturist dynamic to the activism.
I suppose another point, there was a lot of negative publicity around the role given to the private sector as well in COP26, and some disquiet from business groups who thought they'd paid for something that they didn't then get. So yeah, I guess it would have been interesting to see, would there have been less prominent space given to private capital at an Italian COP than a UK one. I guess we'll never know. So that's another imaginary for us all to go away and write about when we need to jot some thoughts down.
But Charlotte, maybe there is another dimension with which you could help us to explore this idea. It's how, and I'm sure you have a lot of ideas about this. How does Brexit affect the balance of power within the EU? Among the member states within the EU regarding environmental policy making. And there are arguments, pros and cons, but I suspect if the EU was a proper green leader, if the UK was a proper green leader within the EU, the UK leaves more room to climate to skepticism and coal lobbying by member states in the EU. That's probably reasonable to think so, but I would like to know what you think about this. And as a consequence, the UK being out of the EU at this time, was it able to exert a kind of presidency which was in a way more active than it had if it had been within the EU? I don't know, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly during the Brexit debates, this was something that exercised a lot of NGOs and commentators about what would the implications be for climate change, in particular in the EU, where the UK had been seen as being critical within Council in pushing a more ambitious agenda and in maybe bringing some more reluctant states on side. And was this going to create a space for those sort of the classic Visegrad states who are a bit more who are much more reliant on fossil fuels, are much more sceptical about climate change? Would it give them a sort of a more power within Council? I mean, again, it's a counterfactual, so it's hard to know how different things are now that the UK has left. There was also, you know, in other areas of policy, a sort of a little bit of a sigh of relief. Oh, the UK is not going to be there being difficult anymore, blocking things that we want to achieve. I mean, I think looking historically, what one can see is that the UK has been fairly willing to stand up and be the difficult European as opposed to the good European in Council. But when it's not been prepared to do that, there are other states who will stand up and be the sort of the if not the difficult European, will take that sort of oppositional position. So I don't know, on car emissions, historically, Germany would be the sort of the state that would maybe block advances in legislation. And I know I've read of, but I can't remember the specific examples where France has taken that role of being a bit more difficult in the Environment Council. So I suspect on balance, it hasn't made a huge amount of difference because there are sufficient numbers of other states who want to see the European Green Deal being adopted and want to see it being ambitious, that they are going to push that agenda. And what we've seen happening with the European Green Deal and the Just Transition Fund is a standard pattern of policy making that we see in the EU in environmental policy development, which is of states who feel they're losing out, who are poorer, putting up opposition to secure some side payments, right? And that's what the Just Transition Fund is, right? It's a side payment to say to states who feel that they're losing out economically and they need some financial support. It's saying, okay, here's some money to help you along. That has taken on a different dimension and a much more complex one with the rule of law crisis. And now what's happening in Belarus has made that even more complicated. How do you have a solidaristic position as an EU, given what's happening on the Polish border, whilst at the same time taking Poland to court over a lignite plant, and also sort of being in dispute with Poland and Hungary over a rule of law crisis. So I'm not sure that the UK's presence would make any difference to all of that complexity going on at the moment. So I think on balance, there were a lot of fears expressed about it, but I suspect it hasn't made as much difference as people thought it would. The one policy area where it might make a difference is common agricultural policy, where there's obviously disputes and demonstrations that have been going on in Brussels over the cap, and is it green enough? And that is one area where the UK again was very proactive in trying to get greening measures adopted and in trying to reduce the amount of spending going on the cap. And I suspect its absence may be being felt a bit more in that space. Was there another question, Richard? I think you had two, and I only wrote down one.
No, I think you.
It looks like Florence wants to comment on the cap. I saw she sat up when I mentioned the cap.
Yes, I'm interested in the I haven't followed closely enough, but you mentioned that there was the Agriculture and Fisheries Act. And I'd like to know a little more about that, because I suspect that some of the subsidies that were going to greening farming are not going to be maintained, or are they? Or is it only Prince Charles who's losing out on organic farming subsidies?
That's an excellent question. And in addition to doing the work on Brexit and environmental policy, I have a grant with fantastic Ruth Little, who works at Sheffield, looking at the impact of Brexit on agri-environmental policy. And one of the things that we're looking at is the government, one of the claims that were made, sort of pro-Brexit claims that were made, was we'll have an independent agricultural policy and we won't be tied into the pesky cap anymore, and that's really bad for the environment, and it'll be much better for the environment once we're outside of the European Union, and we will change our funding system for agriculture so that we only give public money to public goods, so that funding will be explicitly linked to environmental activities. So that sounds great on paper, but as with the climate ambitions, then implementing that has been incredibly challenging, particularly with COVID and particularly with all the delays around Brexit. But the plan is that there will be less money spent, fewer transfers made to farmers, and that transfers that are made should be more targeted towards the environment. And there are a series of pilots being run at the moment to see how that scheme will operate in practice. It's all coming a bit late, and yeah, farmers are concerned because farmers tend to have much longer time horizons, so they would kind of like to see policy being made now for sort of 10 years hence, and that's not yet in place, but it does look potentially better than I think the common agricultural policy did. There is a broader conversation that we need to be having, and I think the European Union needs to have this as well, which is, why do we support farmers in the first place? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And to maybe refocus away from agriculture policy towards rural development policy, because a lot of the transfers that are made in the UK are made to farms that would not make money without previously EU funding or now government funding. So what is it that we're funding them to do, and should we be funding them to do something different?
But Brexit has another, or not Brexit, but the consequences of Brexit in free trade agreements with other countries has also implications on the likelihood of farms surviving, in particular for lamb, from what I understand. But presumably some others too.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting studies showing really variable impacts depending upon the sector in which you're producing. There's certainly been a real push from the farming community in particular to try and sort of maintain British standards and not to weaken them for trade reasons. It strikes me as unlikely that we'll have, I might be wrong here, a trade agreement with the US anytime soon, but I think those debates around food standards in particular have played well with the British public, and so it will be interesting to see what happens in that space. The farming community is mobilised very effectively. The NFU, for example, say actually we don't want to see standards weakened, although there are some things they quite like to see gone, like rules on particular pesticides. But they don't want to see food standards weakened because they see that it would drive some parts of the sector out of business quite quickly. And actually, we just, if you look at America, there's no way that British farms can compete with those absolutely huge holdings that you have in the US. And there are genuine concerns about, the quality of food coming into the British food chain. So that will be an ongoing and live debate, and it's that relationship, that overlap between trade policy then and what you say you're trying to achieve in your agricultural policy. You might have these goals here, but actually you adopt a trade agreement that looks like this, and you end up undermining it. So I didn't mention the US-UK trade agreement removing references to climate change, for example, which would be another example of where stated and environmental ambitions get put to one side in the face of sort of hard economic realities of trying to put in place a trade agreement.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to ask those of you who are still with us online if they want to raise a question. I have a question, but if Lucien or Georges or Florine or Marta wish to make a point. If not, my question, Charlotte, is the following. You said something very, very interesting to me. You said that policy implementations remains and is likely to remain patchy. And from this, I think this is a very interesting issue. One of the possibilities of Brexit could have been to open the way for a sort of withdrawal or dismantling of the British, the UK environmental policy making, you know, in a way responding to some of the constituents of Brexit, saying you know, this is all Brussels and EU regulation, and we don't do it that way. We return to dirty Britain. But this did not happen, right? So we have a sort of green populism. Is Boris Johnson inventing a form of green populism? And so with a lot of verbal commitments, and maybe a sort of weak implementation, or even dismantling through implementation, because with implementation details you can bend. And so this is my question. Do you observe some, is dismantling a reality in UK environmental policy, or not? Is it just a lack of implementation, or what do you think of this?
So that's a really interesting question, and Florence, I think you actually asked something similar, and I didn't get to it because you had so many amazing comments I had to pick and choose. So I don't know if you saw when you were talking, Richard, I went, yet. Right, it's really early days. We've only just adopted the Environment Act, and Andy, who I mentioned, Andy Jordan, did a project with Brendan Moore, who's now at VUB, I think, looking at the statutory instruments that were adopted in order to sort of copy and paste the EU acquis communautaire onto the sort of British statute book. And what became apparent when they did that deep dive is that there's all kinds of gaps and holes that have been copied across, where references to reporting to the Commission have been removed, but nothing's been put in place to replace that. So when I talked about the environmental NGOs are going to have a lot of work to do, I think one of the things that they're going to have a lot of work to do is to be tracking and tracing. Thank you, Yus, for your questions. Lovely to see you. Is to be tracking and tracing whether, when and how dismantling is taking place, because some of that is likely to be quite subtle and will be through statutory instruments and those kinds of instruments that don't necessarily get looked at by the House of Commons or scrutinised very effectively in Parliament. What's interesting about the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and I think Florence referenced this as well, is the extent to which there's a principle of non-regression in there, and it explicitly includes not implementing policy as well as actively unpicking policy. The problem with that is that it's probably quite unlikely. There's quite a high bar that would need to be met before you would consider taking action under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. But it is good to see that recognition that dismantling doesn't necessarily mean actively rolling back policy. It can also mean choosing not to implement it effectively. And I think that is a live risk. And I think that patchiness will come from, there are some areas of policy that the public get more excited about and will focus on. And then there are some that, you know, there isn't the bandwidth, the attention span, the NGOs don't have the energy, where we won't see that attention. And those are probably going to be the areas where we might see that more dismantling by default legislation not being actively unpicked, but just not being progressed or developed in a significant way. I think we will see some dismantling, and we're already seeing some conversations around particular elements of the acquis communautaire. So I mentioned pesticides, the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directives. I think we'll probably see them coming under some pressure. And actually, one of the things that I'm planning to do over the next 2 years in terms of developing the Brexit work is Viviane Grave and I are working on a book together where we're going to try and map some of this and come up with a way of sort of a framework that we can use to understand the sort of the areas of policy that will be most vulnerable or not. So yeah, I think it's less there won't be dismantling and more it hasn't happened yet, but we suspect there might be some coming. But I think you're right. I think it's a nice characterization of Boris Johnson that he's trying to be a green populist, but and I think that reflects the fact that the Conservative Party has always had a core of its membership that care about the environment from that sort of conservationist perspective, that, preserve this green and pleasant land that we live in. We don't want things built on our backyard. And that's something that he needs to be mindful of. And that's why I think the sort of narrative around the red wall seats, if he can find a way of marrying the net zero strategy to levelling up, then that's a sort of a win-win for him. And I think Boris Johnson likes win-wins.
Famous British bird watchers, right?
But how committed do you think he is? I mean,
oh, he's not remotely committed. He's committed to winning elections.
Hmm.
But, I think that's true of a lot of prime ministers. They will, and we certainly see a lot of prime ministers adopting ambitious policies ahead of COPs. And so, but in terms of path dependency, you get that stuff on the statute book and then you have to live with it. And it's quite difficult to unpick it. So, that's a progression of sorts. But no, I don't think he buys it at all. I think crucially, Rishi Sunak doesn't, and he's Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yes.
So that is a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlotte. Extremely interesting, very nice discussion. At least I enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Florence, as well. And Charlotte, well, if you have this book in preparation with Vivian Gravy, you probably need to get back to us and to present this result. It will be extremely interesting.
Yeah, we need to write it first. But, we've got enough material, that's for sure.
And then thank you also, let me remind those of you who are still online that Charlotte advertised for some PhD scholarship at University of East Anglia. And I know Charlotte is very active in supervising and organizing PhD research. So and this is something we all value very much. So thank you, Charlotte, and we'll arrange something so that you can join us in Paris or meet somewhere else. But hopefully to Paris it would be a good opportunity.
It would. I love Paris. It's one of my favourite cities. So my daughter has been lobbying hard as well. When will we go to Paris, Mummy?
So we will find a way. We will find a way. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. We have a next AIRE seminar next week with a PhD and students research presented in the seminar. So you're welcome to join, all of you, if you wish to do so. So thank you, Charlotte, and see you soon.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you in person.
Yes, that would be nice.
Your beer.